Begin by first asking about the kind of research that you typically do and how you think about making an argument in, in the kind of research that you do.
Thank you. I've been a researcher for quite a while now, so the research that I do has developed over time. I started out using critical discourse analysis with interview data. That was my doctoral research, and there I became very interested in how the views that parents hold about their children's literacy and their own connected with the broader social messages that were circulating. This interest in the connections between people's experience of their lives as literate beings and the social environment that they're in, both at the community level and at the broader level where policy is made. This has characterized my work throughout. As obviously, as you develop as a researcher, you get access to more resources, you can pull together bigger teams, and that meant that I was able to develop into more of a multi-site case study approach. I now call this work networked case studies because I see cases as being interconnected rather than easily bounded. So the work also, as with many of us, has began in, I guess, in the face-to-face environment of people's talking and narrativizing of their lives. And now I see myself following these traces of knowledge and practice across in between the online and the material spaces, and also in between local spaces and translocal spaces. So that's how my work has developed over time.
So Sue, when you are going ahead and doing your research, and you've done research in a case study or multiple case studies, a network of cases, and you are looking to make a statement, a claim or a proposition about some aspect of what is happening in and across these spaces, either with regard to policy or practice or the languaging that people are doing. How do you think about constructing that claim? How do you think about warranting that claim, providing evidence for that claim? How do you define doing that sort of work?
In a number of ways. First of all, there needs to be a sense of a need to investigate something from the beginning. So right from the point of designing a project, I already have a sense that there's something that isn't well understood about a situation. I often find, particularly because of the climate of argumentation in the broader society, which tends to be rather reductive, it tends to be quite adversarial, particularly in relation to literacy, where you get, the sides lining up and throwing mud at each other. And also in relation to cultural diversity, which I think tends to be treated in ways that are not really reflective of the experiences of people. My starting point is often a sense that things are more complex than people are allowing them to be. And in terms of educational practice, I think that is consequential. If we can do justice to this complexity, I think that our practice as educators in the literacy and English curriculum areas will be different. And the policy arena can also be responsive to that. So I guess that's an argument that underpins my work. It's a form of conviction that I bring to my work. It's not that I prejudge the outcomes of any particular inquiry. It's just that I usually expect to uncover complexity, and then I need to find a way to make that complexity sort of intelligible, relevant. I need to be able to render it in terms that make sense to educators, make sense to educational researchers, to the community, and so on. Secondly, the analysis is where I attempt to be very thorough. I attempt to, in the interpretative stage of the analysis, I attempt to be open. I entertain alternative explanations for what it is that I'm seeing. As I entertain these alternative explanations, I'm kind of involved in a type of, I guess, a sort of field of debate, because I look at my data as if I wasn't too attached to it, and I think about it as someone may think who holds a different perspective from myself. That means that when I come to form an argument, I do that with the knowledge that there's different perspectives and there's different voices exist in the field. So I try to engage with them in the way that I put forward my own particular interpretations of what's going on.
Could you point us to perhaps an article or two of yours that would be a good illustration of the kind of argumentation that you've just been talking about?
I can. So I've been doing a bit of research on myself because in order to test this out, I had a look at how people are citing and making use of my work. And I tried to find examples where people have really used the argument of my work as a sort of resource. What I think of my work doing is providing resources to others. So if they're able to use it, then I feel that I have been successful in that regard. There's a number of papers. I've actually gone back, I've gone back over my career. People often say you do your best work as a doctoral student. I don't want to say that's true, but you do very thorough work. And so the papers that you derive from your doctoral work should really stand up. And I'm pleased to say that mine have really stood up. So the first paper that I wasn't the first one, but I guess the first paper out of my thesis that people have made use of was called Parents' Construction of Their Children as Gendered Literate Subjects, a Critical Discourse Analysis. And this was published in the Journal of Early Childhood Literacy in 2002. Now, in that paper, I attempted to do a couple of things. One was that in the project overall, I tried to deconstruct the term parent because in my literature review, I was able to demonstrate that when people use that term, they generally mean mothers. If you have a look at the actual participants that they have recruited to these studies, there very few fathers were involved over very many studies. And in my research, I interviewed fathers as well as mothers, and I interviewed a couple of non-custodial fathers as well. So it meant that when it came to a gender analysis, I was able to have a look at whether the parents' gender, whether they were, and these days, of course, we have trans people who are parenting. So I would use different language now. I would talk about people who mother rather than necessarily just mothers. But back then, where it was kind of radical enough to have plenty of fathers in a literacy project. So I had a look at what the mothers and fathers had to say. And I looked at when they were referring to their sons or their daughters. And I was able to uncover times in which the gender of the child or the parent didn't seem to be particularly salient. It was the same kind of statements being made. And other times when we were hearing some really different things from parents talking about boys and girls and from mothers compared to fathers. Now, This work happened in a field of existing argumentation around gender. So it's not as if there was just a kind of a kind of smooth field out there where it was just an open thing. People were attached, very, very strongly attached to particular positions. One of those positions is often described as essentialist. So others would call that biologically determined. So this idea that, a male is different from a female in essential ways, and that's by virtue of the biology. In other words, you should expect to find these differences. What I was able to show was that the ways that parents talked about boys and girls seemed to be ways where they were actively constructing these differences rather than simply responding to what the child was showing them. In other words, if a boy picked up a book to read it, parents would explain that he's copying his sister. So it wasn't as if the boys weren't actually demonstrating, and these were little boys, weren't demonstrating any interest whatsoever in literacy. It's just that there was a need to explain that in some way that the explanation wouldn't have been required for a girl. Now, this is probably a lot of detail to go into, but it was that work that allowed me to make the argument that I did, which was that parents are actively constructing their children as both gendered and literate, and that literacy becomes a field where gender identity is formed in the early years by parents, and that parents are responding to the social arena where these meanings about literacy and gender are circulating. So that was the argument, which I was only able to make out after, doing all of this analysis. And when I had a look at the way that that work has been used, I was able to find that people had correctly identified the argument and they were making use of it in their own work. So for instance, a paper from 2018 by Rex et al. Says Nichols argued that discourses of gender and childhood were extremely influential in the ways that parents talked about, responded to, and managed their children's literacy practices and identities. According to their analysis, and she's referring to myself and another couple of scholars that she's also been reading, according to their analysis, the parents worked to reproduce dominant discourses about literacy and identity. So that's not a direct quote from me. And also there's another scholar being brought into that conversation who's done other work, who frankly, I have not read that other scholar's work. So what it's telling me is that the argument that I've made is contributing to this ongoing dialogue. That paper was written in 2018 and mine was published in 2002. That this is the field of argument is alive. And it's always evolving. So what we try to do is to make a constructive contribution to that.
So Sue, one of the things that was very interesting to me in your discussion of that study you did and of your writing about it has to do with the relationship between the data you collected and the argument that you were making. So I've got a couple questions for you, and maybe you'll talk about them. It would be great. The first is that it seemed to me that the interpretation you made, if you could talk about whether it was based on generalizing data or whether it was based on another way of thinking about your data, perhaps its depth and complexity as you were thinking about it.
Yes, well, it started with recruiting sufficient numbers of parents, not so that I could run a statistical analysis because I'm not a statistician, and not so that I could generalize. I also sought to recruit a diverse sample. So looking at parents who had different histories of for instance, immigration, different occupational status, and so on. And that meant that I had some confidence to begin with that I would see a range of perspectives present in the data. To me, in the way that I work, that's really crucial. I have to make sure that I'm getting that range of perspectives. In another study, which was a bigger study that I did with Jennifer Rousel and Helen Nixon and other colleagues, we once again recruited parents, and we went to some trouble to recruit fathers and to find ways to bring them to the conversation. For instance, I can remember standing on the sidelines of football practice with Helen Nixon, walking around and introducing ourselves to the fathers that were there and asking if we could interview them. So I keep going back to the kind of early stage of the research, but that's because it kind of provides the foundation for the work that I want to do, which is to be able to trace these different strands, these different perspectives. I want to have a pretty rich kind of data set, so that I will be able to not only just look at the dominant themes, if you like, we could call them themes, we could call them discourses or frames or schema, depending on where you're coming from theoretically, but not just the kind of most obvious ones, but the other kind of currents, if you like, that are flowing through the data. The other thing that I would do is listen to the silences. So if you ask parents a bunch of questions about their children's literacy, and the parent deflects, or they kind of just don't really answer the question, then I would find myself thinking, what's happening here? I can remember noticing that my first round of analysis I'd noticed the obvious things. Group of mothers that are like, oh, I love reading, I love it so much. And a group of dads are like, oh, it's a waste of time. And then I'm like, okay, that's kind of what I was expecting. What about all the other people? Because there was still about half of the parents that hadn't been, catered for in those two obvious groups. And I went back to one mum who I noticed in the transcript had really not said very much at all. And I asked if I could have another chat with her, and she agreed. And I said, when I asked you about, reading to your child, you didn't really have a whole lot to say. Is there anything that you would want to tell me? She's like, do you really want to know? I'm like, yes, I really do. And then she said, I hate reading. I absolutely loathe it. I'll never forget that, because it's such a strong statement. And in the first interview, she hadn't wanted to tell me because the stakes are pretty high for mothers, because we've got to be the standard bearers around literacy. So it was through that keeping the dialogue open. I'm so grateful to that woman she then went and told me her history and, why she felt the way that she did. It enabled me to bring different voices into the conversation and to complicate the picture. And my argument came out of that complication.
I want to ask you to shift roles for a second from the role as author and researcher to the role as reviewer when you're reviewing manuscripts that a journal like Research in the Teaching of English asks you to review and provide your insights about. What do you look for in terms of an argument? What do you see and what do you look for about whether they've made a good, sound argument?
I look for coherence, the coherence between the research questions, the methodology that's been used, the way that their conclusions have been derived, and then the way that they can develop a statement of the consequential nature of the conclusions. So all of those things knit together. Now, that's, it's hard to create something that's really strong at all levels, but what the job of a reviewer is is to alert the scholar to aspects where that coherence isn't quite coming together, with the hope that they'll be able to strengthen the part that is kind of, letting the side down, if you like.
Great. We've taken up a lot of your time, but I have at least one more question for you.
Okay.
And that question is, in your review of manuscripts that have come to you to review for journal review, what do you see as some of the weaknesses in the arguments that people are making, so that someone watching this video might say, oh, I need to watch out for that?
Overstatement is one. So I sometimes feel as if the person doesn't have a confidence in the analysis to present the case, if you like. If your analysis is strong, if your conclusions are warranted, there's no need to kind of lay on extra sort of persuasiveness. At least I don't find that is, sways me at all. I'm going to be swayed by the strength of the analysis and the emergence of the conclusions from that strong analysis, and also the coherence with the research questions as well. So overstatement, I mean, look, I wouldn't, it's not a terrible thing. It's just, I'm just a little bit like, oh, do you have to? The other one, I guess, is not having a strong enough evidence base for the conclusions. So it's hard when you've done all of this work, particularly you've done an entire doctoral thesis, you're trying to get one paper out of that. You know that underneath it is all of this analysis you've done, but your reader does not know that. So what sometimes I think I can see happening is that people are kind of trying to shoehorn all of this work into a small paper, and then they put all their conclusions, but I can't see how those conclusions are emerging from the analysis that's being shown to me.
Great, that's extremely helpful. Before we conclude, are there any other comments you'd like to share with people who might be watching this video as they think about submitting a manuscript to RTE or another journal with regard to making sure that they've made a strong and worthwhile argument?
Well, I just really like to see some of the data, like if it's visual and photographic, I like to see some of that. I know that it's difficult with, we can't identify people, but there are ways of photoshopping images that mean we can get around it. If it's people's stories, I like to hear some of the voice. If it's a textual data, I like to see an example of the kind of thing. It just really brings it to life for me, and I try to do that in my own work.
Great. So this has been very, very helpful. Thank you so much for giving us your time, your thoughts, your perspective, and your history of working in arguments in research and in writing research articles for journals and as a reviewer as well. It was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Bye.